What's up, everybody, and welcome back to this couch. And I'm gonna do, this is part 2 of the talk from a few days ago. In this one, I'm gonna be talking about OBD1 cars. I'll try to have the rest of this out by Tuesday, so watch for that. But until then, here is part 2. The whole reason why manufacturers got away from carburetors is not because they couldn't run the engine, obviously. They were doing the job for a long time. But as emissions standards got more strict and harder to hit, and as consumers continually demanded better gas mileage and more power out of smaller engines and less space being taken up under the hood, they eventually reached the point that just building an engine bigger and bigger to make power wasn't going to work anymore, and carburetors just couldn't produce the kind of efficient fuel delivery that engines were going to require moving forward. So the next major phase in fuel delivery and thus diagnostics for modern cars was the OBD1 days, which was the first computer-controlled fuel-injected vehicles. And there's a lot of variance from vehicle to vehicle in this area. You had throttle body injected cars, which only had 2 big fuel injectors in the throttle body, which is really similar in fuel delivery to a carburetor, except for that now a computer could continuously vary how much fuel the engine was getting versus having preset jets and very limited control over fuel. And then you had multi-port fuel injected vehicles, which have injectors in the intake right before the intake valve for each cylinder, which gave the computer a lot more control over how much fuel actually made it into the cylinder. See, throttle body injected and carbureted vehicles have one major problem in that you're introducing fuel to the air so early in the mix that you're really just sort of hoping that the intake manifold design is such that the majority of that fuel arrives in the cylinders you need it to be in, atomized the right way. Versus having fuel injection like that, you can pretty much guarantee that X amount of fuel made it into each cylinder, more or less, other than what gets deposited on the intake valve and that little bit of intake runner. So it was a definite improvement. However, the downsides to the OBD1 days are that when manufacturers first switched over, there was no standardization. Ford had one particular kind of fuel management system. GM had a completely different one, actually had more than one. And each manufacturer pretty much had their own way of going about doing it. The diagnostic service ports were not the same. The way you got codes was not the same. The codes themselves weren't the same from one manufacturer to another. Some vehicles didn't even have a way to pull codes, or at least not a very good way to do it. So though it was an improvement, it wasn't without some drawbacks. And if you own a car in this area, which is going to be like early 80s into up to about 96, the odds are that though you may understand the fuel injection system on your particular car, you may not know much about the other manufacturers. And if you are a shop owner or a professional technician that works on these vehicles in this age, odds are you either have a wide range of equipment to deal with the different kinds of cars, or you just have certain ones you deal with and certain ones you don't, which I don't agree with that, because I think that's kind of limiting. We shouldn't just decide not to learn things. But one good thing about those now, the diagnostics, you can't really make any claims about the diagnostics across the board for OBD1 cars, because some are really good and then some are not very good. For example, my 91 240SX, that car, the early Nissans like that, their fuel injection systems were really simple. Pretty much the computer just ran the engine and that was it, and it didn't monitor much of anything. So for example, once again, my 91 240SX, I had every ounce of the emissions equipment on that car removed before the ECU was ever changed or modified at all, and never had a check engine light. As a matter of fact, I had a friend who had a 240SX who had an EGR valve stuck open, and since of course those early 240s didn't monitor the EGR system in any particular way. There was no check engine light for that. It was causing a misfire that took us a while to figure out what was going on, just because of the fact that the ECU, while the car's running like crap, is telling us everything's fine. Ford ECUs were pretty specific. GM ECUs were fairly specific and monitored most things, but then how you get the codes is sort of a different way. Data streaming is not as possible on a lot of models, so compared to new cars, they're still pretty limited. But if you have one of these cars, the great thing is, if you want to be able to see what the check engine light is doing, most of the time you can pull codes with nothing more than a paper clip. Now, some imports are not like this. This doesn't go for everyone, but specifically for Fords and for GM cars, there's 2 pins in the data link connector on each, which are different because, once again, they're not standardized. The Ford data link connector is completely different than the GM one for OBD1. But you can jump 2 pins together and count the flashes on the check engine light, and it'll give you the codes. You don't need any equipment beyond that, which is nice. But so this system worked okay, but it wasn't the best in the world, and from a technician standpoint, it's a little frustrating because just everything was so different. You were constantly have to learning new stuff. But that's kind of just the way that went, but engine efficiency came up quite a bit. It was a good step overall. All right, guys, thanks for watching, and as I said, I'll try to have the rest of this out by Tuesday. If you're liking this series, let me know in the comments. And other than that, if you're new to the channel, subscribe and hit the bell icon, and I will see you guys in a couple days. Peace.